different. By the way, Babylon is a geographic location. When I say Babylon, please don't automatically connect that to pagan worship. So when I say the Babylonian Talmud, it is a section of Gemara that happened to be written in the geographic area known as Babylon. However, by the time the Talmud is written, Babylon has been destroyed for 1,000 years. The kingdom known as Babylon, that did Babylonish things, that did detestable practices, they haven't been around for 1,000 years. The area itself has simply retained the name. 4 or 5 different kingdoms have come in. Why is that important? Because there are people on the internet today who have no scruples and few brains and say, oh, the Babylonian Talmud, yes, because it's connected with the worship of Babylon. Well, no, this is kindergarten, this is remedial kindergarten stuff. To understand that the Babylonian Talmud was named that because it was written in the area that used to be called Babylon, is today called Iraq and Iran, but was up for grabs. The Jewish people found a way to live at peace with whomever took over. Whomever took over realized that these Jewish people are a benefit to the area. All of these seminaries where they're writing this strange thing called the Talmud, that benefits our economy. So we're going to let them stay. That's fine. So the Septuagint translation, the Old Testament books into Greek, becomes the most commonly used Bible among the common people. Scholars continue to use Hebrew. They continue to write in Aramaic. The common people probably spoke Aramaic. But for many individuals, more modern individuals, the Septuagint is easily accessible. And the Septuagint becomes the Bible of the early church. That bears repeating. The Septuagint becomes the Bible of the early church. Many of the Old Testament quotes that you see in the New Testament match far more precisely the word order of the Septuagint than the word order of the original Hebrew, which shouldn't surprise us, because the New Testament is written in what language? Greek. New Testament is written in Greek. It doesn't surprise us then that it is carrying forward the Greek translation that was in use at the time. So the Septuagint becomes very, very important. The Ptolemies, eventually, their power runs out. So the Ptolemies are down here. Again, I apologize, I don't have the convenient map to show you. But the Ptolemies are down here in Egypt. The Seleucids are up here in Syria. Back and forth they battled. They actually had wars against one another, even though they believed the same thing. Eventually, the Seleucids up here in Syria pushed the Ptolemies out of the land of Israel. And the Seleucids take over, as you see in the overhead here, in the PowerPoint, and in your outline, capital C, the crisis of Seleucid rule. Again, the Seleucids are simply a name for the people in Syria who fully embraced Hellenism, and Alexander the Great was on their coins. They were Alexander the Great's boys. They embraced that culture, and they wanted to spread it. They were militant Hellenists. Whereas the Ptolemies said, hey, it's cool, live and let live. The Seleucids said, no way, all you Jews have to embrace Hellenism, whether you want to or not. So we say there that there was enforced Hellenism. No more Mr. Nice Guy. There is enforced Hellenism where Jewish people are increasingly forced to adopt this. Into this mix comes the fourth Antiochus king. The word Antiochus is like it's a word that refers to a dynasty of the Seleucid kings. it was handed down from father to son. Antiochus the first, the second, the third, the fourth. Each one became progressively more narrow and more militantly Hellenist. By the time you get to the takeover of Antiochus IV in the year 175, he is on a rampage. And he is enraged. What do you mean that these Jews are still holding out and won't bow down to our beautiful statues of Aphrodite and all of these, and Jupiter and Zeus and all of these others? What do you mean that they insist upon holding their own worship services? We can't have this in the midst of our kingdom. And so the story goes, and the story is mostly found in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, as well as in the writings of Josephus. And 1st and 2nd Maccabees are somewhat reliable history. 3rd and 4th Maccabees are not. And so into this, the story goes that he wants to enforce Hellenism on a new group of people. And so Antiochus IV becomes king, which leads to the revolt of the Maccabees. The revolt of the Maccabees is buried in a mix of fact and legend. Just heroes arose during this time. Let me sketch out for you the traditional Jewish view of what happened. And I well understand that some of this cannot be corroborated. Some of it may be later embellishments. But if you would ask the rabbi what happened, what's the story of the Maccabees? How did they revolt? And how did this give rise to the Jewish holiday today known as Chanukah, one of our favorite holidays? Certainly, it is my son's favorite holiday because many Jewish kids get a present every night of Hanukkah. And my son cleaned up during those years. Hanukkah Harry visited our house very often. Somehow, my wife would say, I think I hear some rustling in the basement. And let's go down, see if the Hanukkah Harry left anything. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm not saying that's theologically correct. It may have been a temporary backslidden condition by our son's parents. But Hanukkah Harry reigns big in many Jewish homes. He wears a blue and white suit, by the way, has a nice gray beard, kind of like mine. And he does his thing. Why does he do his thing? He does his thing because in every generation, someone has tried to destroy the Jewish people. Who is pulling the strings behind the wars that tried to destroy the Jewish people? Who's pulling the strings? Satan is pulling the strings. Why? Because Satan heard in Genesis chapter 3 that there's going to come a people who are going to give birth to the Messiah. Satan, ultimately, that Messiah is going to crush your head. You are doomed. So Satan's goal during what we'll call Old Testament history is to stop the coming of the Jewish people, is to stop their arrival. Once they have arrived on the scene, he tries to stop their progress. Once they progress, he tries to somehow thwart the plan of God. If Satan had been successful at destroying the Jewish people before the birth of Jesus, who would never have been born? No Jesus. And so we see every world empire successively take its shot at the direction of Satan to try to destroy the Jewish people. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes and Persians, the Greeks and the Romans, every single one of them, in one way or another, either tried to physically destroy the Jewish people, or like the Greek Hellenists did, try to assimilate us, get us to stop being Jewish, so that the Messiah would never be born. So in each one of these instances, they tried to kill us. And so for every one of the Jewish holidays, the chant is the same thing. They tried to kill us. We won. So let's eat now. Hanukkah, Passover, many different holidays follow that same prescription. And so with this Maccabean revolt, you have this crazy man, Antiochus IV, who enforces Greek gods. As the story goes in later retellings of the story of the Maccabees, he comes to this little town of Modi'in, not far from Jerusalem. And Modi'in was one of the cities where retired priests were allotted some land. And so there was this old priest called Matathias, the story goes, that was retired there, and his sons lived around him. One day, the Seleucids sent in to the center of Modi'in, they sent a little portable idol of one of the Greek gods and goddesses, along with a half-dozen soldiers. They made a big announcement, everyone come to the center of town. You need to prove your loyalty to our great king Antiochus and your loyalty to the great gods and goddesses of our Greek civilization. And so they say anyone who does not do this will be reported, and ultimately you will be imprisoned or you will be executed. Who will be the first to show the other people here how to bow down to these Greek statues? And everyone's kind of, trembling, and they're all afraid and scared. And finally, an old man's thinking, well, I'd better do this, otherwise horrible things will happen. He starts to go forward to worship the Greek statues there. And at this point, Matthias, there in your outline, Matthias is watching all of this. The people are watching Matthias because he's the most godly man in town. And all of a sudden, Matthias is enraged that this man would bow down to the statue. And so as his 5 adult sons are watching him, this old Jewish man runs over to one of the Greek soldiers, where the Greek soldier is standing there like this watching. He grabs the guy's sword, pulls it out of his sheath, and the traditional statement is that Matthias raises the sword and says, "Whoever is on the Lord's side, follow me." People are like shocked. What are you going to do, old man? He's holding the sword. They didn't expect him to do anything. All of a sudden, he brought the sword down on one of the soldiers. And people are shocked. His sons are shocked, his 5 adult sons. And at this point, they have no choice because the other soldiers are starting toward their father. So the sons grab the swords and they get into it with the soldiers. And there's a big group of Jewish people, there's half a dozen soldiers. They overpower the soldiers. Whether you want a revolt or not, you've got one now. And so from that point onward, the story goes, the revolt of the Maccabees spread. The older brother was known as the Hammer, okay? Not MC Hammer. If you know MC Hammer, you're old, okay? Not that type of hammer, but rather the word Maccabee is an older Hebrew word for hammer. Maybe he was a blacksmith. Maybe that's the type of work he did. And so he winds up leading all of his brothers as they carry on the revolt. And the revolt expands from this little area around Judah and becomes nationwide a revolt against the oppression of the Seleucid Empire. In essence, it is a guerrilla war. So in your paper outline there, capital D number 2, Judah Maccabee, and there are operettas about Judah Maccabee. He expands the revolt against the rule of the Seleucids. Other people jump on the bandwagon. They're also unhappy with Seleucid rule. And finally, they banish the Seleucids from the land, except the Seleucids are now holding up in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has walls, so it can serve as a fort at this point in time. And the soldiers there, the Maccabee brothers, and all of those who were under them, they attack the defenders there, who were the Greek soldiers inside Jerusalem. Eventually, they overpower the soldiers, and of course, just like in the 1967 Six-Day War, the soldiers raced for one goal, and that was Har Habayit, as we say in Hebrew, the Temple Mount. And they wanted to see what condition the temple was in. Could worship be restored? Now, the temple in those days was a small shadow of the Temple of Solomon, yet it was the center of worship. And so they rushed to the Har Habayit, to the Temple Mount. They clear out the remaining pagan soldiers, and they are shocked to see that in an act of intentional defilement, in an act of mockery, the Greek soldiers had been sacrificing pigs on the altar of Jehovah. So they had defiled the altar. And so they set about very quickly to clean the entire area, to once again have it serve as a place of worship. And accounts vary, and at this point there's very little evidence that is ancient. A lot of the story of Chanukah is only, maybe 1,500 years old. We see it in the Midrashim. We see little tidbits in Gemara a little bit. But the story goes that as they cleaned all of this out, they were looking to reinstitute the temple worship. And in the holy place, you know that there were three items. There was a lampstand menorah that had three branches on each side and one in the center. There was that lampstand menorah. So in this illustration on the PowerPoint, on the left, you have a modern depiction of a traditional menorah as found in the temple. This one very closely follows the ancient illustration on the Arch of Titus. Outside of Rome, there's a gigantic arch that celebrated the destruction of Jerusalem. The arch was erected in the year 82 AD. When was Jerusalem conquered by the Romans? 70 AD. 12 years later, the Arch of Titus is erected, and one of the sculpture reliefs on the inside of the arch shows Roman soldiers carrying off a menorah. The menorah appears to be approximately 5 feet high. It's hard to really measure that because it's an artistic depiction, but it had three branches on each side, one center stem, just as Torah had indicated. And so the desire of the Maccabees was to relight the menorah with the pure oil of olives as was instructed. But they looked all around the temple, and according to the traditional Hanukkah story, again, you're not going to find this even in Book of Maccabees, but in latter tellings of the story, as they looked around the temple compound, they found no oil, except they found one small jar, one small clay jar of oil. And this jar of oil was a one-day supply. If poured into the little bowls and the wicks at the top were lit, this would have been a one-day supply of oil. Problem is, the process of pressing the olives and purifying the oil and filtering it is a process to produce good olive oil that takes at least 7 days. However, in faith, as soon as the temple was cleaned, the Maccabees took the 1 day supply of oil, put it into each of the 7 cups at the top of this menorah, lit it, and then, of course, quickly took off for the hills to press more olives. And the supposed miracle of Hanukkah is this, that instead of lasting just 1 day, this 1 day supply of oil lasted 8 days. enough for them to rededicate the temple to the worship of Jehovah, to the one true God. The word dedication, essentially there's a root, there's the three-letter root that forms the word today we have as Chanukah. And so when we find in John chapter 10, Jesus is at the temple in Jerusalem. He's on Har Habayit. He's on the Temple Mount. He is there to personally, as Jesus the Messiah, he's there to personally participate in the celebration, in the observance of Chanukah. Here is the God of creation who orchestrated the events of Chanukah, and he's deigning, he is allowing himself to be enveloped by human flesh and to simply go along and show up at the observance of Chanukah. So Hanukkah is the one Jewish holiday that is celebrated that in the Bible is only found in the New Testament. Why? Because the New Testament is a Jewish book. Not surprising at all that they celebrated Jewish holidays in the New Testament. You have Jewish people who had embraced Jesus the Messiah, who celebrated Jewish holidays as they always imagined they should. So, as a result, you have this 7-branch menorah here on the left, the traditional Hanukkah menorah. On the right-hand side, you have what is called a Chanukiah, a Hanukkah menorah. So on the left is a traditional menorah, on the right is a menorah with 4 branches on each side. Why? Because the rabbis at some point, after they sussed it out and they argued about how we should celebrate Hanukkah, one rabbi said, well, we should start with 8 lights and each night extinguish 1 light. Another rabbi said, no, that's crazy. Let's start with 1 light. And each night we add a light until the miracle becomes greater and greater and greater, so that by the 8th night of Hanukkah, we have all 8 candles burning brightly. As a kid growing up in a housing project in Brooklyn that was 90% Jewish when we first moved in, it was a brand new housing project, and the fix was in. They were letting in mostly young Jewish families. So my parents fit that bill, and all of the living rooms were lined up. You had 8-story buildings, and every living room was lined up right on top of the other. There were 23 buildings, by the way, 23 buildings on a quarter-mile square plot of land. Each floor had 9 apartments, and so all the living rooms were lined up. During the early years, every single window had either a candle menorah or more usually had this great new invention called the electric menorah. Electric menorah is not a dance. The electric menorah is the thing that if you were a modern Jewish family in 1961, you wanted an electric menorah. None of this old European stuff where we lit candles inside the house. You wanted to show that you were a modern American Jewish family. You had plastic. And so in the hardware store, they used to sell dozens in the week before Hanukkah, dozens of these big, gaudy, can't give them away now, Hanukkah menorahs. And that's how I remember growing up. But then when we went to shul, when we went to synagogue, we'd do the whole thing with the candles. So that is the world that is within this 400 silent years. The last book of the Bible is written around the year 450 BC. 450 BC is the last book of the Old Testament. The New Testament canon does not start to get written. Well, Jesus is born, what we today call the year 0. Actually, it was 4 BC. So from 450 BC to 4 BC, 450 years, what's happening? That's why some historians say these are the 400 silent years. They weren't silent. Lots of good and important stuff happened there during those years, and the Maccabean revolt was one of them. When we resume on Monday morning, we'll talk about the Jewish world that Jesus steps into, Sadducees, Pharisees, how did all that happen? See you then. Seid gesund.